So it's literally got, I'm looking at the numbers right now. California has a fourth of what Texas has planned,
Oh
and
my
they're
goodness.
second largest.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, if AI is an energy race, then Texas is just lapping the field. How did a city better known for its culture and its music become a place where America keeps trying to build the future of hardware? Today, we're going to talk about semiconductors. In 2022, Washington passed the CHIPS and Science Act. Its semiconductor provisions were meant to encourage reshoring of semiconductor manufacturing, but also strengthen supply chain resilience, R&D, and workforce strength. And to that end, almost $53 billion were directly appropriated. Cities like Phoenix have been major beneficiaries so far, but so has Central Texas. Actually, Samsung received one of the largest awards made under the program to expand semiconductor production in Taylor and in Austin. And now we have another plot twist. So in March, Elon Musk said that Tesla and SpaceX will come together to build Terafab, an advanced chip factory. The initial investment is estimated at $55 billion, which is more than what was appropriated by the government for the CHIPS Act, and wild.
Yes, completely.
The factory is likely to be constructed midway between Austin and Houston, actually closer to Houston, with the Gigafactory in Austin, though, providing the initial prototype fab operations. So this isn't the first time that Austin's actually been thrust into the spotlight for chip manufacturing and innovation. The story starts much earlier, and for very good reason. I'm Lauren.
I'm Jen.
And this is Build Order. Before we get into the story, we have to talk about what are semiconductors. And simply put, it's a material, typically silicon, and it has electrical conductivity. They are the essential components of nearly all electronic devices. You would not have laptops without them, cell phones, and actually many household devices that are increasingly connected, at least in their current form. Now, Silicon Valley owes its name and its identity to the rise of semiconductors and actually to firms like Fairchild and Intel. It's literally where the silicon in its name comes from. It's also where work hard, play hard culture comes from in the area. It's where that was born. Venture capital on Sand Hill Road, and also the whole fail fast mentality that's defined Silicon Valley and its startups for a long time. So basically, semiconductors were once a frontier industry, and it was around this industry that the entire Bay Area transformed from fruit orchards, apple orchards, into a center of global technology.
That's right. And in the same way, we have all of our peach farms here in the Austin area that are being converted to, or have been converted to, various chip manufacturing sites as well. So what happened in Silicon Valley is now happening in Silicon Hills. And I do have to say, Lauren, because I was also wondering, what does semiconductors even mean? I looked it up because my husband asked me if it's conducting electricity, why is it semi? Why is it a semiconductor? What's the half conducting that's going on here? So it's actually only half conducting because it's allowing you to switch on and off very easily. And that's what creates the binary ones and zeros that are the base of coding today. So in case anyone was actually wondering about the specific word semiconductor, that's where it comes from. And silicon specifically is a much better conductor for doing that semi-conducting than like germanium or some of the other materials they used to use before.
Well, let's travel to Austin now. And so Austin didn't start as a cultural center. Before Austin was weird, it was kind of this like sleepy college town and a state capital preoccupied with attracting the right industries to the city. And actually, this is pretty fun. So in 1957, the Austin Chamber of Commerce commissioned a research report to study what industries they should try to attract to Austin. And the study recommended poultry farming, air conditioning equipment, and fortunately for us all, the development of electronics. And by the way, I thought this was fascinating. Electronics were considered desirable because Austin was supposed to be, even at the time, this sort of like clean, nice place to live. And they didn't want any of these like dirty industries around here.
And by dirty, I think they mean oil and gas, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it didn't hurt that the electronics industry was conveniently non-unionized at the time.
I'm sure. I'm sure that was a very exciting feature for the government.
Yeah. Well, so what's interesting to me is that Austin's active courting of all these electronics businesses eventually worked. And Jen, I know you were looking into that.
Yes, and the big tech industry in Austin traces its roots back to one company, one big company, back in 1955, Tracor. And if you haven't heard of Tracor, they did anti-submarine warfare, aerospace countermeasures, and just basically commercial electronics. They were huge. They were the first Fortune 500 company in Austin ever. And for the longest time, they were the only big dog in town. That was until some of these other major players moved to Austin from the big tech industry, with IBM first, then Texas Instruments, then Westinghouse, Motorola, Data General, AMD. The list goes on, but these were the first big movers, really led by IBM. I would say IBM was the hinge. Why did IBM come here? Funnily enough, the city had something to do with it, but not as much as maybe you would think. So Vic Mathias ran the Austin Chamber of Commerce. He did create, a few years prior to IBM coming to town, the Austin Economic Development Council, so that these big tech companies did actually have someone at the city to reach out to. Now, they did not know that they were conversing with IBM because IBM sent individuals with these packets of information, completely anonymous, to ask about different sites and incentive opportunities.
Who did they think they were?
Who did they exactly? They had no idea. They were just like, okay, some big tech company is interested. But Austin did not know, the city, Vic Mathias and his team did not know until IBM made the public announcement that it was them that was coming to town, that they'd been negotiating all of these incentives with.
Yeah, that's so interesting because it's so different today where the tech companies kind of publicly shop their new headquarters for tax advantages and other incentives.
Totally, exactly. And even some of the big tech consortiums, which we'll talk about in a minute, they also shopped it publicly. But IBM, for whatever reason, wanted to be very hush-hush and under the radar about this search. So what did they actually build here in Austin? They built a manufacturing site for the Select Script typewriter. It wasn't the sexy hardware software that we maybe think of IBM today. It was just typewriters, and it was 500 jobs at first. But at its peak, IBM manufacturing in Austin grew to over 10,000 jobs. So it was a huge win for Austin to get a big national company like IBM here. But it wasn't just Vic Mathias who really helped shepherd in these big tech companies. A big player was John Gray. John Gray ran the Austin Economic Development Council, which, as I mentioned earlier, was pre-IBM a few years. He really led not just helping with the IBM incentive package, but also TI, AMD, and many of the others that I already mentioned. But perhaps my favorite John Gray story, which I believe you also know, Lauren, is the bedsheet flyover story.
I don't know that I know this one.
You don't know this one. Okay, so Texas Instruments, TI, was interested in site selection in Austin, and they were more public about it, that, hey, we're interested in evaluating Austin. But they were so busy with all of their other site selections that the president did not have time to physically go and meet with the Austin Economic Development Council to check out the site. But he had time to fly his private jet over the site a couple of times. So John Gray, in his wisdom, said, how can I make sure they know exactly where the site is? Let me get some bed sheets and just wave them around like a madman. So that's what he did. There's literally no more literal metaphor than saying like, hey, big tech, come to Austin, than waving a bed sheet around.
That's amazing. I love those stories about Austin because you don't hear them very often about cities that are like, hey, we're here.
Yes.
Come build here.
Yes.
It just, and in such fun ways.
They really are. And there was that. There's many other stories. There's another fun one with Motorola, which at the time was a huge big tech company and a big win to come here. Again, Vic Mathias, who I mentioned ran the Austin Chamber of Commerce, was very instrumental and helpful with John Gray. So when Motorola said, hey, we looked at sites here. We didn't find a good fit at the price point. We're just going to go somewhere else. He didn't take no for an answer. And he happened to notice that a 92-acre parcel next to Tracor was available in a
Mm.
completely separate meeting, and called up the Motorola guy and said, hey, I found this land. It's amazing. And he's like, well, sorry, I already found somewhere else. But if you want to fly to Arizona, happy to catch up with you. And he was like, yeah,
Mm.
I would love to have lunch with you. Flew to Arizona the next day, showed up an hour early to his office, pitched the plan, and that's how Motorola ended up in Austin.
That's amazing. I guess that shows if you want it and you're willing to work for it, there's still a chance.
There is, yes. No doesn't necessarily mean no in business negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's just fair to say that we think of Austin's tech industry today as being very software first, but
Mm-hmm.
it definitely started with hardware, with UT research, with a typewriter factory, and with a guy waving a bed sheet at a private jet.
Yeah, totally. I think it's fascinating that we even think of Austin sometimes as a software forward city. And I think that just speaks to all the big tech firms and sort of their legacy and the fact they've set up shop here. But it has such a long pedigree in hard tech, in dual use, in like physical atom led tech, which is pretty different from how other cities have kind of like evolved over the last few decades, particularly San Francisco, which also started with hard tech and with semiconductors.
Yes, and now they've swung so far into software that I don't know that they're as diverse as Austin is today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
But a big part of Austin's tech story wasn't just the corporations moving here, it was also these massive consortiums, right, Lauren?
Yes. Okay. And this is a really, really fascinating part of the Austin tech story, which it doesn't get enough credit for, or just kind of generally we don't talk about it as much. Austin was home to not one, but two major semiconductor research consortia. And just to understand how wild this is. So if I narrow the field to like big, national, strategic, microelectronics, semiconductor consortia of the era, which is the 80s, then the list is an N of three, which is actually kind of wild because we don't really do that anymore. So it's MCC, Semitech, and SRC. Two of the three were in Austin. And Austin at the time hadn't even broken 500,000 people. It was very much like a mid-tier city, sleepy city. So to talk about the two, so first there was MCC, the Microelectronics and Computer Technology Corporation. This was a private sector consortia. It was formed by major U.S. technology companies, and they were supposed to collaborate on advanced computing and microelectronics R&D at a time that the U.S. was losing ground to Japan. And MCC in particular really put Austin on the map. Austin won it in 1983 over 57 other cities in 27 states.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay, and then there was Semitech. And so this was actually a public-private consortia this time. And it launched in 1987. And it's credited with restoring U.S. chip-making competitiveness at the time because its focus was on bending the manufacturing cost curve, and it was very successful. And again, it was against our Japanese rivals in the industry. So in this case, Semitech actually chose Austin over 137 competing cities.
It's even more impressive.
It's wild. Yeah. So, I mean, I think so in true build order fashion, it wasn't just chance that they got it. And it wasn't just kind of the raw city ingredients, which there were, right? If you think about the university and you think about ample land and power, and you think about actually the technology companies that were already here. And also there was kind of a component that was sort of interesting around maybe this was more neutral ground than some other areas that were like the major headquarters of certain companies. So they would be more likely to want to collaborate on kind of this like neutral space. But in true build order fashion, a coalition actually came together to get both of these consortia done and here. How did that work?
Yeah, it's a great point that Austin had all of the ingredients, but at the same time, so did many other cities, right? 137 competing cities is what you said, right? That's so many
For
other
Semitech.
for
I know.
Semitech. Yes,
Amazing.
that's
What is
so
that? It's like every city in the country.
I mean, every major hub in the country competing, and somehow Austin won. And a big part, as you said, was the universities, but it's not just a university town. And the Austin story and how Austin won isn't so much a city story as it is a state story and a coalition coming together across the state of Texas. The key players involved were Bobby Inman, Governor Mark White, Pike Powers, which great name, Dr. Ben Streetman, Ross Perot, even. And
Really?
then perhaps most important to Austin's gravitational pull of big tech, not just the consortia, was George Kosmetsky. So let's talk about each of them. Bobby Inman, he was the one who was the CEO, the first founder and CEO of MCC, which again was the first big tech consortia to come to Austin. He had quite the resume. So former NSA director, former CIA deputy director, 4-star admiral. But on top of all of that, he was also a Texas native, and he also went to UT.
Mm.
So there was this perception that he might just be coming home to Texas, and he wanted to make sure that he chose the site for MCC as being the city that wanted MCC the most. That's why he made it a public site selection process. Now, the funny thing about Austin landing MCC, Austin as a city didn't even know about the site search at first.
This is a recurring trend here.
A recurring trend, yes. So they didn't even know about it. San Antonio knew about it. Mayor Cisneros of San Antonio applied, was rejected, and then called up Governor Mark White, who was governor of Texas at the time, and said, hey, we should make this a statewide initiative. And Governor White took that and ran with it. So he treated MCC like a strategic priority for the state, launched a technology council, and not only that, he even invited the site selection committee from MCC to his personal home over whiskey to talk about the process. So this guy really, really took it to heart that it was important.
Yeah.
But even more important than Governor Mark White was his right-hand man, his chief of staff, Pike Powers. He helped build the incentive package that eventually drew MCC to choosing Austin. So MCC wanted a university that it could grow with. Of course, we had UT, but UT wasn't enough. He also said, let's make sure that the land that MCC builds its site on is at Balcones Research Center, which is part of UT. Not only that, UT will build the building and only charge $1 in rent.
Wonderful.
So how can you say no,
and
right?
were they given the money by the state to do it?
So funnily enough, no. It seems that the university actually footed the bill to make sure. And this was, again, the credit to Pike Powers for being the glue that pulled all of these different entities together, from government, corporations, UT, and even key individuals from UT, like Dr. Ben Streetman. He was credited with stealing the show in a presentation in front of MCC executives, so executives who helped form the initial consortium. Dr. Ben Streetman had been doing some very interesting research with microelectronics. He presented it. The CEOs loved it. And that allowed them to see UT as not just a land grab and a free real estate option, essentially free, but actually a place where they could grow with the research being done there.
Because they were understood and there were resources.
Exactly. All right. I can't get through this without at least giving some credit to Ross Perot.
This is amazing. Yeah, go ahead.
The billionaire logistics guy. Who knew Ross Perot was credited with MCC coming to Austin? He actually lent his personal private jet to the CEOs of the MCC consortium, who were part of the site selection committee, so that they could easily fly from wherever they were in the country to Austin, which was a big deal because it shows how broad the coalition was. It wasn't just state and government. It was powerful individuals across the state.
Yeah.
And last but not least, one of those other very powerful individuals was George Kosmetsky. And I know, he was credited with the term Technopolis, right?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so he was the one who basically said Austin is going to be a technopolis. It is going to be very forward-thinking, and essentially was the guy who pre-MCC came up with all of the groundwork that made Austin attractive from a big tech standpoint. So let me just quickly share some of the things that he did.
Yeah.
He was the co-founder of Teledyne, which was a tech company, the founding dean of UT's business school, also the founder of the IC Squared Institute, if you've heard of this. And he called it a think and do tank.
Oh, that I didn't know.
Think tank.
Yeah, love it. Yeah, it's great.
Yes, love it. And the goal of this think and do tank was to encourage regional economic development, again, before the MCC ever even came to town. Really, it connected the dots between a lot of the major corporations and the startups in tech that eventually became major corporations. Best example of this was that IC Squared, and particularly George's office, had a direct hardwired phone line to Michael Dell's office.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And he was the one who said, hey, Bobby Inman, CEO of MCC, I want you to do an angel investment in Michael Dell's company and serve on his board.
Mm.
So he was just the guy who knew everyone, was connecting all of the dots, and really helped grow Austin's tech economy from $4 billion in the early 80s to over $140 billion 40 years later.
Yeah.
So thank you, George Kosmetsky, for all of the work that you've done to make Austin what it is today.
Did he ever talk about what his motivations were for wanting Austin to be, the center of technology?
That's a great question. I think it was just his private personal interest. I mean, he was a tech founder himself and just saw the greenfield opportunity for Austin to become the city that it eventually was. And
Yeah.
he's often called the architect behind Austin as a technopolis.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it wasn't just him. It wasn't just Kosmetsky. It wasn't just Pike Powers. It wasn't just Perot as individuals. Again, as you said, it was this coalition behind the state of Texas, not even just Austin.
Yeah. And it even carried over, right? One thing I find really interesting about the story too is Pike Powers was then instrumental in getting Semitech
Yes.
chosen in Austin in a few years.
Exactly. And I
Or a few
think
years
him
later.
having won MCC just made it all that more easier to get these future consortium, future companies to move here too.
Yeah. It's funny because where do you sort of land on this? So, and this comes up over and over in build order. Do you think that the ingredients were what mattered most, or do you think it's the people and the package and the politics that sort of made this industry happen here in Austin?
I think it's the people, because you don't have these layers without people coming together to build them first.
Yeah.
Right. So if we didn't have George Kosmetsky creating the groundwork, if we didn't have Pike Powers just wheeling and dealing with all of these individuals and corporations, I mean, he's the one that helped convince Ross Perot and all of these other entities to wine and dine, essentially MCC and eventually Semitech and some of these others. And if he hadn't done that, I don't know that our best foot would have been put forward.
Yeah.
But what do you think, Lauren? Do you think it was the city that was attracting them, or do you think these people had a bigger role?
I think that the people were almost like the ignition spark, where if they hadn't done what they'd done and wanted it and packaged it and worked for it, it wouldn't have happened. But I do think that Austin, too, by some kind of series of historical accidents and plans, ended up being a place where this was actually perfect because UT was here. And UT was chosen to be in Austin in the late 1800s by a vote. I mean, it didn't even have to be here. And then obviously you have Intel that came and a number of other tech companies. So I know that was a big part of the pitch, that there were already a number of companies working in technology in the semiconductor space here in Austin. So it was a nice kind of ground where they could all collaborate. That wasn't even necessarily the place where they were competing the most, which was Silicon Valley. And I've read elsewhere that they deliberately didn't want these consortia to be in Silicon Valley because it was almost too contentious. So I thought that's interesting because that didn't have to happen, but it did over time. Although, I'm sure there's people who take the other side of that argument and say it was inevitable that UT would be in Austin because the capital was here. Or, maybe it was inevitable that some of the tech companies would come here because of the university.
Maybe, but it is interesting to your point how much they cared about place even then, that you can't do it in Silicon Valley. Everyone's going to be too competitive. So it has to be somewhere on neutral ground.
Yeah. And another thing I find really interesting about this story is not that we don't do, and I think the CHIPS Act shows this, national planning these days. I find it really fascinating that in the 80s, we were sort of engaged in these consortiums where we were deliberately bringing together private actors. And that, I mean, when was the last time something like that happened? And the quote unquote threat was something quite similar to what we're experiencing today, where, Japanese companies were kind of, out competing us in semiconductors.
Right.
And they said, let's bring everyone together. And I I just wonder to what extent that would be possible again, and if that would actually add value to say, I don't know, for like the AI chips race, why don't we do a consortium and bend the cost curve
Hmm.
somehow altogether? Or maybe for energy production and utilities, why lose a global competitive race when we could win it
Potentially together.
potentially together? Yeah.
I have to say that was my first thought going through this in my notes. It's like, why don't we have this for AI today?
Mhm.
But my conclusion, and I am curious to hear what your thoughts on this are, but it didn't seem like MCC was particularly successful at the end of the day.
Hmm.
So maybe it was just that there were a couple of good companies that spun out of it, a couple of great companies, but there wasn't like hundreds of companies. It wasn't Bell Labs, which the hope was that it could be Bell Labs. And it really wasn't, because at the end of the day, these are all corporations who have their own initiatives that they're fighting for.
Right.
And I agree. I mean, why couldn't we have OpenAI and Anthropic cooperating, not colluding? Because again, the government blessed MCC before it was created in order to try to defeat China, whether it's on inference or training or chips or energy. I mean, there's all these different paths that we need to be able to beat our competition on.
Yeah. I so Semitech, unlike MCC, is credited with being a very, very big success in terms of making the US more competitive from a cost perspective at semiconductors. And I wonder, this is just a hypothesis, but maybe they were more successful because it was considered non-core, if you will, to the industry. It wasn't R&D. It wasn't cutting edge R&D and where you'd have an edge over your competitors. It was like, let's all bend the cost curve so we can even continue to exist relative to the Japanese industry at the time. And I think Semitech, part of the reason that it ended up in Austin was because MCC was here. And so it was like that initial groundwork allowed the second consortium to happen. So yes, I think, anyway, it's interesting.
Do you know how much the Semitech consortium actually decreased the price of semiconductors?
So, under one estimate, Semitech-driven equipment improvements to bend the cost curve, right, help cut the Japanese industry's yield advantage from 50% over the United States in 1985 to only 9% in 1991. So, Semitech was a really successful consortium from the perspective of reducing the cost curve or making American semiconductor production more successful. And one of the reasons that I think that might have been more successful or even better model for the US is you can sort of consider this as like non-core to these companies, where if you think about their R&D, that's really cutting edge. That's where they get their competitive edge against each other. But working together to drop the cost curve, and something that now we understand to this day with semiconductors to basically be a margin activity, was very, very impactful. And so I wonder to the extent like we could be doing more things like that with especially AI chips, where it's all coming down to like power and packaging and just, making the hardware more efficient, or on the energy side. But it's a super interesting model, and I don't think that Semitech would necessarily have come to Austin if it hadn't been for MCC. And the fact that they knew how to put together one of these packages, they were able to take that muscle and turn around and use it right for Semitech a few years later.
Right. Well, today is a bit different, though, in the sense that the people who are involved at these companies, especially I'm thinking Sam Altman and Elon Musk, with all of their beef, for lack of a better word. Like, do you think these guys would actually come together if they felt that a consortia would work?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I guess we don't know who the characters were back then, and if they were kind of more collegial or kind of were competing a bit more.
Yeah, and today's day and age with social media, it just ramps everything up to the nth degree.
Yeah. Something else that I hadn't thought about was MCC was a private consortium, whereas Semitech was a public-private consortium. The government was behind it. And maybe the government is sort of needed to step in a little bit and create the foundation or funding for one of these to exist in an area that it thinks is critical. But we don't think about things like that anymore. We think about things like, okay, survival of the fittest and competition is going to make us better. And, and that's great. And that's how it works for us. And we should keep that. But when we have this sort of like tragedy of the commons thing going on with energy and just with production bottlenecks, I don't know, like, would we benefit from saying, hey, there's some areas where we should just like rising tide lifts all boats, and it's not even core to your strategy. It's just going to make you more efficient and help us kind of blast through the bottlenecks and create more capacity or create more volume.
I think that's exactly right. And it's, to me, my mind goes to sports, right? If you're on the Olympic track and field team or the Olympic gymnastics team, yes, you want to win that gold individually, but you are on a team with other athletes. And at the end of the day, you want that team medal too. So you want the US to win. And it seems like we need a bit more of that mindset with the AI companies today.
Yeah, but more clever, or even from the government perspective, because I mean, the CHIPS Act is kind of the way we do things these days. Let them all compete for money. But it's, it's not coming together, which, if you think that's important. I also think it's interesting because it's not like the 80s were known as, like, the 80s weren't exactly like the post-World War II time when we were like engaged in these very large public projects as a society.
Right.
The 80s were highly capitalist. And so it's really fascinating that we even approached it that way then.
True. And I don't think as many people know that Semitech happened.
No.
Right? Like, they didn't know that this big consortium actually drove America to be a big hardware country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Semitech, the CHIPS Act, they studied Semitech in order to guide the development of the act.
Interesting.
Which is interesting, but they didn't actually do any of the, I mean, they looked at it to see how it was successful, but they didn't actually implement the same model. So I find that also kind of maybe in more limited ways that we don't know about, where they've given, I mean, they've obviously given grants as well, to universities and for R&D purposes. So maybe they conceived of it in that fashion. And maybe they thought about like bending the cost curve, which is absolutely part of the CHIPS Act. But maybe they didn't think, for some reason, they were like, okay, well, all these companies aren't going to come together.
The people. Maybe it was just, we don't think these leaders are actually going to work together. Therefore, let's take a different approach. I think that's entirely possible.
Yeah. So while the consortium efforts, if you will, from the 1980s held off Japan, semiconductor did move to Asia eventually, in particular to Taiwan and TSMC. But that was the past. The deck's been reshuffled again. So we need to talk about AI. And AI chips are still semiconductors, but the bottlenecks are no longer only about making the chip itself. The bottlenecks sit in advanced packaging, memory, interconnect, power, cooling, workforce, and full system integration. So in other words, the challenge just got bigger. And that may matter for Austin. Austin's old advantage wasn't that it invented the silicon chip or that it was the single deepest semiconductor city in America. Its advantage was that it knew how to coordinate and could attract everyone here, could line up the university, the businesses, political support, the industrial ambition, and actually win. And just as an aside, as a New Yorker, I find this totally fascinating because, as you know, Texas being perceived as such an individualistic state has been the site, again, of two major like centers of coordination in the 80s for semiconductor production and manufacturing R&D. So that's just totally, Texas is really good at coordinating, actually. And actually, LBJ would probably say the same thing.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's the question. If the challenge in the AI world and era is sort of bigger, broader, more infrastructural than kind of the old chips semiconductor era, is AI and that era actually a better fit for Austin than the old days ever were?
Absolutely. I definitely think it's a better fit for Austin. Yes, we may be individualist, come and take it mentality, and we're going to win at all costs on an individual level, but we are from the South. Like, Texas is its own version of the South. Everyone here is considered very friendly, very welcoming. And a lot of people who live in Texas still have this mentality that Texas is its own separate entity. While, yes, we are part of the United States, we are from Texas. Like, when you travel abroad, you say you're from Texas. You don't necessarily say you're from the US, which is ironic, but that is the Texas mentality. So I think we just have this natural desire to come together as a state, especially, not even just as a city. And that is like the TerraFab announcement with Elon Musk. Some people in various news releases would say, "Oh yeah, it's outside of Austin," but we Texans know, no, that's like really outside of Houston. But we don't care. We're just glad it's in Texas, right? It's a win for everyone that way.
Yeah. Implicit in your argument is that Texas, or to win at AI, you have to be really good at coordination. And Texas is good
Yes.
at this.
Yes, exactly. And it's good at not just if you take Texas broadly. Texas is excellent and top tier, not just in different aspects of technology and defense technology, oil and gas. Texas would be a leader if it was a separate nation, which I'm not advocating for that, just with oil and gas production itself. And that energy is needed to build data centers, which are then powering AI, of course. And more, we're seeing that these massive data centers can't connect to the grid because there's this backlog of energy demand. So they're actually building their own power plants that entities like Chevron and ExxonMobil are all contributing to, and said they've had plans for different site developments in West Texas. And I read an article where the Houston Chronicle energy grid reporter said that the state of Texas is expected to be home to more data centers than anywhere in the rest of the world by 2030.
Amazing. Yeah. And it's interesting because, and I completely agree with you on the coordination part. I think Texas is very good at that, and history shows that from MCC and Semitech. And that is a big component of this AI age, because you need to bring in power. You need to bring in data centers. You need to bring in manufacturing of the chips. There's all these dual use companies and startups and technologies that want to use them. And then you have also, you mentioned energy. You need these raw elements in order to make this all work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like you agree.
I do agree. I'll add something to it, which I find really fascinating, which is agree with you on coordination. I also think that, and the data proves it out, the AI era is much more about power than the old chip making race ever was. Not that chips aren't energy expensive, they are. But this is interesting. So the IEA says global electricity demand from data centers grew by 17% in 2025. And AI-focused data centers grew even faster. They grew by 50% in 2025.
Wow.
So making these chips and scaling them and running compute is even more energy intensive than what we had previously. And I think that unless other states change their strategy, Texas has the clearest power advantage for this industry and for dominating this space. And I really think that might be what it just comes down to.
We also have nuclear energy startups that are growing really quickly here, especially in Austin, like Allo, for example. Or I know there's plenty of VCs here who are investing in nuclear. So we are, as a state, coming together on multiple different energy generation sources.
Yeah. Last time I checked, Texas has over 20% of its power generation is wind.
Oh, really?
Up near the Panhandle.
Wow.
Yeah.
That makes so much sense.
Like the freeze that happened in Austin a few years ago, right? And they froze, right?
Yes. That's right.
And, a lot of people don't know that because they obviously, and rightly so, consider Texas, the seat of the oil and gas industry in the United States, which it very much is. But it's actually going to be in 10, 15 years, just like the power generator of the United States.
Yes.
And I can prove it. So
Ooh, tell me more.
Yeah. All right. Texas is #1 in the country for net generation and net summer capacity. If you look at just, megawatts and megawatts per hour. These are from 2024 EIA numbers. And for those of you who don't know, the reason that net summer capacity matters is basically a measure of how much capacity you have in the summer when the demands are highest, because people are using air conditioning and things like that. It's also #9 in the country for lowest average retail price for energy for consumers. And this is amazing because obviously energy costs are in the news these days. And the other large energy producing states in the country, so California, Pennsylvania, Florida, Illinois, like they're among the top 5 with Texas for just, pure power production, they don't even come close to Texas for basically cheap retail energy. And actually, California, and this probably won't come as a surprise to anyone, but they're number 49 out of 50 states for
Well, that's a
retail
surprise to
price
me, really. Wow.
affordability. Yeah,
I didn't know they were almost dead last. I mean,
they're
I knew they
almost
were
dead last.
low, but
Yeah, and they're like really dead last because number 50 is Hawaii, which is an island, and they have their own they have their own challenges. Yeah. Okay, here's another really, really fascinating stat about Texas and its energy. So if you look at the EIA tracks this, if you look at monthly electric generator inventory, this is basically tracking all the projects that are trying to come online and create new generator inventory in the country. And caveat to this, so this is promised, not necessarily completed, right? So these projects can move out, but Texas accounts for a third of the national pipeline.
whoa.
So it's not just leading; it's actually lapping the field. So it's literally got. I'm looking at the numbers right now. California has a fourth of what Texas has planned,
Oh
and
my
they're
goodness.
second largest.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, if AI is an energy race, then Texas is just lapping the field in terms of what's going to be available in the next few years.
That is wild. And it absolutely is an energy race. I mean, every person that we've talked to in the AI industry or the data center industry has said that the limiting factor to growth is energy production.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. Yeah. And it's true for creating new factories, whether you're making advanced and packaging AI chips, or you're making dual use technologies, or you're building data centers. I mean, everything we're planning on doing as a society over the next 10 to 15 years is going to require a ton of energy. And Texas is the one producing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, fortunate for us that we're at the bottom of the build order in terms of what's needed to be built.
That's right. Yeah. Well, so do you think that any other states can conceivably kind of win a component of all this? And, I think we have to split it out a little bit too, because obviously AI is very broad. So we've been talking, we have the AI chips, which is, a legacy, if you will, of kind of the semiconductor production. Then we have AI models. And then we have obviously the data centers, and then we've got some of these dual use or just hard technologies that are trying to use all of the above. How do you think about this?
I think the only industry you didn't mention there, which is critical to growth across all of these industries, is finance. So where is the capital coming from that is funding all of these projects? And today that's still Southern California. Certainly New York is a big piece of it too. Dallas is certainly a leading finance city across the state or across the country, really, but it would need to become much larger for us to say, yes, Texas has the opportunity to just win across all of these major industry opportunities.
Yeah.
That's my 2 cents. What do you think?
I agree. I think capital, not that they won't invest elsewhere, but they like proximity. And,
They do.
there's a reason that the VC network exists in the Bay Area and Northern California, and it's right next to a number of different AI and software startups.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
like to be able to observe in their backyard
Yeah.
exactly what the startups they're investing with are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps that's why some of the founders have moved to Austin over time, is they don't want as much oversight. Is that crazy to say or crazy to think?
Could be.
They're like, let me move to Texas. That way I can have a little more
Absolutely.
personal freedom.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let me get out from under their thumb. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I find California is really interesting here because obviously they're still one of the largest energy producing states in the country, and you obviously have this really deep tech bench there that's playing in AI, and it very naturally played in the frontier models and what we're doing just like with AI software itself, it dominating the software industry. But I feel like it's almost with some of the stuff that we're trying to build over the next 10 years that is much more energy intensive, that requires physical assembly of things. You look at California and you say, I mean, how can you build that there today, given the regulation and given the energy? And I've got another really interesting tidbit on California and Texas just historically. So California always had an electricity cost disadvantage to Texas. But in 1985, its industrial power cost was roughly 1.4 times what it was in Texas. In March of this year, it was more than 3 times.
Wow.
So they've made it very hard for themselves to participate in at least like building and assembling, this stuff. And you could still have the headquarters over in the Bay Area. You could still maybe have the capital there. But if you buy the assumption that software and hardware is going to have to be much more intimately linked, and you might not want to get on a 3-hour flight to go see what's going on in the factories because you need to iterate quickly, I think it's just going to be really hard to build those businesses in California today, unless they change what they're doing. But it doesn't feel from the politics that they're prepared to do that right now.
That's true.
So we talked a little bit about why Texas has the coordination and the energy to just kind of kill it at the AI race. Also has a lot of land and low regulation.
Exactly.
What do you think about Austin? What role does it have to play? And, if you were Austin, what would you do to kind of carve out a piece of it?
Keep growing UT and keep focusing on research, because it is insane how fast these companies are innovating. And Austin and UT need to be a part of that story on a national and a global level in order to keep Austin centrally focused, right? So I think it's really the research aspect that is most critical and that Austin can actually have some influence on, versus, yes, we can have incentives for these companies to come here. Yes, that is important. We're already doing that. And a lot of other cities are already doing that. What can we do that's differentiated and unique? I think that comes back to talent. What do you think?
I agree. I think that's number one in my mind. And number two is probably some of the boring but essential city stuff, which is zoning, ensuring there's power, water, ensuring that the cost of living remains, at least somewhat affordable for people to come to the city and move here, just so that Austin can keep growing sustainably while these industries are growing alongside it.
So we talked a lot about why Austin, and particularly why Texas, might win in the AI race, the chips race, the energy race. But is it just Texas that needs to win this? Are there other cities or states that have a chance? What do you think?
Yeah,
Why?
there are a few others that I'll definitely, I think, take a piece of the pie. I don't think it's winner takes all, although Texas has some great advantages here for a number of components of this new AI value chain. But I mean, you have Virginia, it has a really deep existing US data center ecosystem, and it's obviously close to the government. Arizona, that's where TSMC is building its fab and its facilities, and they have a lot of data centers and semiconductor chops, if you will. It's also from this is interesting, from a geography perspective, because it's dry and it's sort of like inert land. There, you don't have to
Okay.
worry about like earthquakes and hurricanes and stuff. Arizona is actually a really nice place to build semiconductor fabs because you're always trying to control for predictability. They need to come out the same every single way. You don't want defects. California, which we obviously mentioned because of the talent, because they're working on the frontier models, because of the deep capital bench. I think, now maybe they just own software in the end. And then New York and Ohio actually have really deep R&D capabilities. We've talked about Columbus and data centers. Upstate New York has a lot of R&D capabilities in semiconductors and sort of like adjacent industries. You also have Corning that's there, that's building a lot of fiber optics and just pieces that need to go into data centers. Anyway, so I think there's a few interesting other cities that could and will win. Obviously, it's a huge industry.
This is one of those rare opportunities in life and in corporate globalization where there is an opportunity to have multiple winners.
Yeah.
Not just at the corporate level, but at the state level, at the city level. There's just so much pie to be had.
Yeah. And what's unique about Texas is it has so much of the raw materials to own multiple aspects of this new kind of AI industry, whether it's data centers, whether it's production of kind of hard tech, robotics, satellites, space, whether it's chip manufacturing because of the power and the land and the talent, things like that. And I'm excited about Austin for that because, it's the most natural like command and control node in Texas.
Yes.
It's the city in Texas that has the tech bench.
Exactly. And it actually benefits from being central to the state in that way.
Mhm.
It's not too far from Houston, not too far from Dallas, Houston being the energy capital of the state, Dallas
Mhm.
being the finance capital of the state. So it's the gateway to the west where all the data centers and all the power plants are being built, all the
Yeah.
private power plants
Yeah.
by these oil and gas companies.
The
So,
state government's here, so when you need a little incentive for your data centers, they're nearby.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Well, let me. All right, Jen. So, what did you take away from this conversation?
Well, what I took away is that I am even more impressed by how much opportunity Texas has to continue leading and growing with AI, and not just AI in terms of, oh, we're training and we have different AI companies here that are perhaps built off of Anthropic or OpenAI, and really just floating on their coattail, flying and really just flying on the back of their coat. What's the expression? I'm really bad at idioms.
Floating?
Floating, flying on the, hanging on the, I don't know.
I don't know.
Anyway,
I
there's
wish-
something on the back of their coattails. But really, it's the opportunity with energy being
Mhm.
such a big constraint, and Texas already being a powerhouse there and being at the forefront of innovations in energy. And the new financing that's coming to town with IPOs, especially SpaceX.
Mhm.
And also, like you talked about, we have been the seat of chip
Yeah.
manufacturing for some time, and that is now a focus of our national government.
Mm.
I'm just impressed at how much Texas stands to benefit from all of these various strengths that we've had needing to be strengths at once.
There's a historical parallel here, which is really interesting to me, that Austin's first semiconductor period in the 80s really put the city on the map. And it feels like that's happening again, in the sense that you have major technology companies that are opening up shop here. You have UT that's winning really big R&D grants again in the space. And you have multiple startups that are sort of choosing to build here. But it also feels very different this time because demographically, Austin's really broken out. It's not the small, sleepy city that it was in the 80s. It's much, much bigger, and it wins across a number of different industries or participates these days. You also have just such a breadth of startups and industries that are choosing to grow here. And that's quite new, whether it's robotics or space tech, satellites, you name it, defense tech. And that's quite different. And then the last thing that's quite unique about this time is the fact that the old city champions are kind of losing their edge. So San Francisco, which is the natural place and the Bay Area for this to grow, has serious cost concerns and ability to coordinate for some of these industries of the future. So it's sort of theirs to lose, but that's quite different with the Austin story this time around.
It is. You know what that made me think of
Mm.
is, do you remember the article that Mark Andreessen wrote years ago about how software is eating the
Yeah.
world? Now it's hardware eating the world,
Yep.
and specifically all of the semiconductors and the need for more power
Mhm.
to generate AI infrastructure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
And Austin is at the perfect central spot to be for all of these areas.
Yeah. Yeah. So it feels quite different this time. And I think that's where we'll leave you this time, which is, whether Austin will sort of like fully own this dual use AI future is, remains to be seen. But it does feel like this is pretty different from what happened in the 1980s. And what could happen over the next 10 years here in terms of what's built here could really cement Austin as a major tier 1 city in the country. And so that's it for this time, and we'll see you next time on Build Order.